Last month, you may recall, David Wood and I debated Anjem Choudary and Omar Bakri over the question that is the central question of my new book, Did Muhammad Exist? Now, we found that Choudary and Bakri were not really able to deal with the question. They were only able to answer things like, of course Muhammad existed, it's in the Quran. And so this second episode of the Jihad Watch program will again take up the question, did Muhammad exist, with a new debate, and I think a much more formidable debater. And so once again, we have moderating Chris Conway tonight, and he will set up the program.
Thank you very much, Robert, and good evening, everyone, to this program, Jihad Watch. We're excited to have you here on this Memorial Day weekend. It is May 28, 2012. I will start off with a couple of bios. Robert, of course, will be one of the debaters tonight. Robert Spencer is the director of Jihad Watch, a program of the David Horowitz Freedom Center, and the author of 12 books, including 2 New York Times bestsellers, The Truth About Muhammad and The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades. His latest book is Did Muhammad Exist? And an inquiry into Islam's obscure origins. Debating him this evening is David Wood. And David is the host of ABM's live talk show, Jesus or Muhammad. He's been in more than 30 moderated public debates with Muslims. And you can reach David on his blog at answeringmuslims.com. And to start this program, we'll call out to David. David, are you there? David, are you there? I see you, David, but I'm not hearing you. We're wondering if you do you hear me, David?
I hear you.
All right, excellent. I can hear you too. Okay, great. Well, now that we have that settled, we are going to start this program with a 12-minute opening statement by you, David, and then, of course, following you will be Robert Spencer. We'll start the clock at 12 minutes, and then about 30 seconds before that 12 minutes is up, we'll have a sound that will indicate to you have 30 seconds to wrap things up. So, David, the program is all you. The topic tonight is Did Muhammad Exist? You have 12 minutes. You can start right now.
Thank you, Chris. I'd like to thank Robert as well for his new book and for defending his position on ABN tonight. I read Did Muhammad Exist? And I'll be honest, it was way better than I thought it was going to be. I had read Robert's books, The Truth About Muhammad and Religion of Peace, and they were both excellent. But when I heard that Robert, his latest book, would be a challenge to Muhammad's existence, I thought that Robert had finally gone off the deep end. Now that I've read it, I can say that Robert's new book is filled with material that's absolutely essential for anyone interested in the early history of Islam, and especially in the development of the Quran. Every chapter is indispensable. With that said, I still believe in the overall picture of Muhammad that most Westerners who study Islam would believe in. He's born somewhere around 570. He starts delivering revelations to his followers somewhere around 610. He preaches for 12 years or so in Mecca. He flees to Medina. He builds an army. He conquers his enemies, that sort of thing. So I'm not a Muhammad skeptic. But I can say that Robert did affect my confidence level. If someone had asked me, say, 6 months ago, David, how sure are you that Muhammad existed? I would have said, 99.7% sure that Muhammad existed. Whereas if you ask me now, I'd have to say, 90, 92% sure that Muhammad existed. So Robert's book shifted my confidence somewhat, but I still come down heavily on the Muhammad existed side of the debate. Now, why do I believe Muhammad existed after reading Robert's book? Well, since I just brought it up, in the debate Robert and I had against Anjem Choudary and Omar Bakri, I said a few words about the historical method, and I'd like to expand on what I said there just a little bit, and then my case for Muhammad's existence will become clear. As I pointed out in that debate, when historians investigate an event or a person from many centuries ago, there are 3 things they're looking for. First, historians are looking for early sources that were written soon after the events they report. Sometimes we can gather reliable historical information from writings that come 100 or 200 years after an event, but we'd much rather have sources that were written within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses. The more time that passes before someone writes down what happened, the more time there is for myths and legends to develop. So in general, the earlier, the better. Second, historians like to have multiple sources. One ancient author telling you that something happened is some evidence, and depending on the author, it might even be good evidence. But it's usually not as good as having several ancient authors telling you about the same event. Having a number of different sources allows you to compare and contrast stories, and this can help you weed out bad information. So all else held equal, the more sources you have, the better. Third, historians want these sources to be independent. So think about it. If Robert and Chris and I tell you the same thing, but it's only because Chris and I are repeating something we heard from Robert, you don't really have three separate sources. You have one source, that would be Robert. Two people repeat what you said. It would be much stronger if Robert saw something happen and he tells you about it, and Chris saw the same thing for himself and he tells you about it, and I saw it too, so I can tell you. Now, you don't just have one source, you have three independent sources. So putting all of these ideas together, when historians try to reconstruct events that happened in the distant past, they'd like to have multiple independent early sources. And when it comes to Muhammad, we don't have that. We don't have anything close to that. We don't have any early detailed biographical sources, let alone multiple independent early biographical sources. There is a massive gaping hole in the historical record that should be filled with references to Muhammad in the Quran, going out supposedly conquering in Muhammad's name. But it isn't filled with those sorts of things. Our stories about Muhammad come from much, much later. The Muslim sources are late, they're biased, and they constantly contradict each other, even on basic detail. So Islam is on very shaky ground historically, and this allows someone like Robert to come in and wreak havoc on people's beliefs about Islam. But I've got some good news for our Muslim viewers. Historians often have to deal with late, biased, unreliable, contradictory sources like the one Muslims are forced to use when they want to learn about their prophet. And historians have developed principles for gathering kernels of truth, even from writings as weak and defective as the Muslim sources. One principle is especially relevant when we try to examine Muhammad's life. It's called the principle of embarrassment. The idea is that when someone admits something that makes him look bad, or makes his belief look bad, it's probably true, because he wouldn't invent something that's embarrassing to him. When people invent things, they invent things that make themselves or their beliefs look good. So when we examine testimony, we can ask ourselves, is this the sort of thing someone would just make up? If it's not the sort of thing someone would make up, have at least some reason to believe that the testimony is accurate. Applying this principle to Muslim sources, Muslims are going to, it's about Muhammad, they're obviously going to fabricate things that support a particular theological position.
We're losing a connection here with you, David. We're seeing you, but you're cutting out.
Okay, well, that's got to be on your end, because my Skype connection is...
You're good now.
You good?
Good now.
All right, make sure I get like an extra 15 seconds for your technical error.
Okay.
So, applying this principle of embarrassment to the Muslim sources, if Muslims are going to invent things about Muhammad, they're obviously going to invent things that make Muhammad look good, or things that support their particular theological positions, or things that vindicate a certain sect of Islam. And there's no question the Muslim sources are filled with things like this. But the key is Muslims aren't going to invent stories that make Muhammad look stupid or immoral or evil. So when we open the Muslim sources, if we find stories that make Muhammad look bad, the best explanation for why we have these stories is that they really happened. And if they really happened, then Muhammad obviously existed. Now, do we find embarrassing material in the Muslim sources? Of course we do. But as Robert points out in his book, we have to be careful here, because what's embarrassing to Muslims today living in the West wasn't necessarily embarrassing to Muslims nearly 14 centuries ago in Arabia. Muslims in our time are embarrassed by all kinds of things we find in the Quran and the Sirah literature and the Hadith. According to Muslim sources, Muhammad had sex with his 9-year-old child bride, Aisha. He had sex with his slave girls. He allowed his followers to rape their female captives and to have sex with prostitutes, and to beat their wives into submission. Muhammad ordered Muslims to assassinate his critics and to execute apostates and to violently subjugate Christians and Jews. He supported his religion by robbing people. He had a man tortured for money. All of this is horribly embarrassing to Muslims in our times, which is why they deny these things. But it wasn't embarrassing to the early Muslim community. So the principle of embarrassment wouldn't really apply here. If these practices were acceptable to Muslims in 7th century Arabia, there's no reason someone couldn't have invented them. But we find other stories in the Muslim sources that are quite different. They were embarrassing even to the early Muslim community. We know they were embarrassing because we find early Muslim historians trying to water down the stories or to explain them away or to erase them from history. Let me give you a few examples. First, we know from Muslim records that when Muhammad began receiving revelations, his first impression was that he was demon-possessed. When Muhammad fled the cave of Hira, he was convinced that the first 5 verses of Surah Al-Alaq, the 96th chapter of the Quran, had been put into his head by a poetry demon. What changed his mind? His wife and her cousin convinced him that he wasn't possessed, he was a prophet of Allah. Is this the sort of story Muslims would invent if they want people to believe in Muhammad? I don't think it is. Second, we know that after Muhammad's experience in the cave, he became suicidal and tried to hurl himself off a cliff. Now, if you are manufacturing a prophet to unite the Arab people, do you think you describe him as history's first suicidal prophet? I certainly wouldn't. Third, according to our earliest Muslim sources, Muhammad delivered revelations from the devil. These are the infamous satanic verses. When Muhammad delivered the original version of Surah 53 to his followers, he said that in addition to Allah, there are 3 goddesses that Muslims can pray to, Allat, Alusa, and Manat. Muhammad delivered these verses to his followers. He bowed down in honor of them, and his followers bowed down with him. But a little later, the Prophet of Islam came back and said that these verses, which he had delivered as part of the Quran, weren't really from God, they were from Satan. And he replaced them with the words we find in the Quran today. Now, if you wanted to invent a prophet, wouldn't you portray him as a man who couldn't, wouldn't you portray him as a man who could tell the difference between a revelation from God and a revelation from Satan? I certainly would. Fourth, we know from multiple references in Sahih al-Bukhari and other sources that Muhammad was the victim of black magic that made him delusional and gave him false beliefs. According to the story, one of Muhammad's enemies stole his hairbrush and used it to cast a spell on him. The spell lasted somewhere between 6 months and 2 years. Now, tell me, if you were inventing a prophet to suit your fancy, would you say that his enemies could take him out with a magic spell? Not a chance. Fifth, Surah 4:3 says that Muslims can marry up to 4 women, but the Muslim sources tell us that Muhammad had a lot more than 4 wives. Al-Tabari says that Muhammad consummated marriages with 13 women. We know from references in Bukhari that Muhammad had at least 9 wives at one time. And the reason, according to Islam, that Muhammad got more was that he received a special revelation, Surah 33:50, which gave him and him only special moral privileges, namely lots of wives. Needless to say, if I were inventing a prophet, I would invent stories that show him violating his own revelations. 6, we have the Zainab story, where Muhammad marries the divorced wife of his own adopted son after Muhammad was the one that broke up the marriage. And the justification, according to the Muslim sources, is so ridiculous we can't help but think that that Muhammad was coming up with revelations in order to justify his behavior. And finally, according to the Quran, Allah rescued Jesus from people who wanted to kill him. So obviously, if we're inventing Muhammad, we're going to have a similarly miraculous end for Muhammad. But how did Muhammad die, according to the Muslim sources? He was poisoned by a Jewish woman whose family had been slaughtered by Muslims. The poison ate away at Muhammad's internal organs for 2 years before he finally died in total agony. Why would Muslims write in their sources that Muhammad's greatest desire was to die in battle and then turn around and tell us that he died at the hands of a Jewish woman? Now, Robert responds to almost all of these in his...
About 30 seconds left.
Robert responds to most of these in his book, and he tries to explain reasons why people would have invented them. So Robert agrees with the principle of embarrassment. The difference is going to come down to whether his explanations for why these stories would be invented are the best explanation. I would say that the best explanation for why we have these stories about Muhammad is that, like it or not, no matter how embarrassing they are to Muslims, these things happened, and if they happened, then obviously Muhammad existed.
Okay. we're good. That includes your 15 seconds for that technical error that we had there.
All right.
Thank you very much, David. We reset the clock now, and Robert, you have 12 minutes to respond.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, David. I want to reiterate first some of the things that David said at the beginning. That is that historians, in trying to assess the historical reliability of a figure in the distant past, look for early sources, multiple sources, and independent sources, and we have none of these for Muhammad. And David referred to a massive gaping hole in the record, and that is indeed a massive hole. It has to be emphasized that it's extraordinarily strange and completely inexplicable that if Muhammad existed and delivered the Quran in whole, although it wasn't collected till after his death, but it was complete, presumably, at the time of his death, then the Arabs began to conquer the Middle East, North Africa, and Persia in the 630s, 640s, and the subsequent decades, energized by and motivated by the teachings of Muhammad and the Quran. And yet they never mention either one in any of their communications. And the people who were conquered, who left abundant records, and they say that the Arabs came and they laid waste, they never call them Muslims, they never say they had a holy book, they never say they had a new prophet, they never say they had a new religion. They call them Ishmaelites, Hagarenes, Saracens, and so on. They never call them Muslims. And so the only thing that people who believe in the existence of Muhammad can point to is the criterion of embarrassment that David enunciated. And I have to say, actually, that when I wrote the biography of Muhammad, The Truth About Muhammad, although I was aware of the very shaky historical reliability of the early Muslim sources I used for that biography, I also believed in the criterion of embarrassment at that time. And I remember having a conversation in The Hague with Ibn Warraq and saying, why would Muslims have invented these stories if they cast their hero in a bad light? And he, of course, very calmly pointed out something that I had never thought of, that David has already enunciated as well, that what's embarrassing in the 7th century or the 8th century or the 9th century in a very different social and cultural context is not what's embarrassing in the 21st century to Americans or even to Muslims in the Islamic world. And so David lists 7, and I'll go through these. There are explanations for all of them. For example, Muhammad being afraid that he is demon-possessed. Ultimately, it is determined that he is not demon-possessed. One of the clear reasons to invent a story of that kind is to lay to rest charges that all of this is demonically inspired in the first place, and say, well, that's been considered. Actually, it was considered by the prophet himself, and then ruled out on the basis of sound evidence. The idea that he was suicidal is also bound up with that he was afraid that he was under the spell of dark forces, and then those dark forces appeared to him and reassured him that they were not dark forces at all, and he was completely reassured and went on to fulfill his mission. The idea of the satanic verses, that he delivered revelations that turned out to be satanically inspired. This is, of course, a persistent embarrassment, and most often you'll find Muslim apologists saying that this event didn't happen at all because they have no explanation for it. But the clear explanation for it, if one posits that all of this was made up by a committee and by various people over a period of time in order to develop a religion for the Arabs that would justify and unify, strengthen, and help expand the Arab empire, then obviously if this thing is in a position of flux and if this religion is being developed, it's going to go through stages, and it's going to go through stages that contradict earlier stages. And so there has to be some explanation made of why things were taught that then are not taught. And so it's exactly the same if one believes in the existence of Muhammad and saying that he's a false prophet who changes his teaching to suit the changing situation, and then he has to explain that. It's the exact same explanation in this case, that the Arab leaders, in developing the stories of Muhammad, they had to explain contradictions. And so this is the explanation for it. It's the same thing when he's the victim of the black magic. Here again, he emerges victorious over the black magicians, and so this is designed to reinforce that this is not black magic, that this is distinct from black magic, and that it is powerful over black magic. The idea that Muhammad has a special exemption from his own moral law. Well, Allah can do what he pleases, as we know is repeated many, many times in the Quran and in Islam. And Muhammad is touted in the Hadith, as David well knows, as having been given the sexual potency of 60 men. And this is something that's held up as a sign of his extraordinary position, his extraordinary virility, that he was not like other men. He was not an ordinary guy, but he's somebody worthy of obedience and worthy of emulation. The idea that his end is ignominious has another political purpose, that instead of dying in battle, he dies being murdered by the Jews. The demonization of the Jews is something that runs as a golden thread through the Hadith, as well as the Quran itself. And it seems to be a particular preoccupation of the Arab leaders at the time that the Quran and the Hadith were being put together to demonize the Jews, as evidently they saw them as formidable opponents to the new religion. And so to have them even going so far as to kill the prophet, as they killed the other prophets, as the Quran endlessly reminds us, is just another brick in the wall of their dehumanization and demonization. And I left the Zainab story for last, because that one is a bit more complicated. This is the most clearly embarrassing story to Muslims. It appears that even the account in the Quran, as elliptical and clipped as it is, in chapter 33, is evidence of the embarrassment. The basic story is that Muhammad married his former daughter-in-law, and evidently some of the Muslims were upset. And so Muhammad, in order to get around the laws of consanguinity, he said, well, there is no adoption. And chapter 33, verse 4 and 33, verse 37, it rules out adoption for Muslims. And Zayd, who was Muhammad's adopted son, has to go back to using the name of his father and call himself Zayd bin Haritha rather than Zayd bin Muhammad, because adoption is illegitimate, as it is in Islam to this day. Now, the thing about this story is that it ends with a very curious sentence, and that is, Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, rather he is the seal of the prophets. It's a curious doctrine in the Quran that all the prophets are blood relatives of one another. They are, as the Quran says, of one seed. And of course, as is well known, the Quran even presents Jesus as the nephew of Moses. Now, the idea that the prophets all had to be from one bloodline made it clear that if the Arab leaders who were making up Islam had to present Muhammad as the last prophet, to avoid challenges from other prophets who might weaken their empire by becoming the center of a divided loyalty, then they had to make sure that Muhammad would be emphasized as the final prophet, the seal of the prophets, which meant, if all the prophets were of one bloodline, that Muhammad could have no son, either natural or adopted. And this story was invented in order to show that Muhammad had no son, and that he even did have an adopted son, but Allah ruled out the necessity for adoption, ruled out the legitimacy of adoption, and emphasized that by giving Muhammad in marriage his adopted son's ex-wife. And this was no violation of the laws of consanguinity, because Muhammad was not this man's father or any man's father. It's also an indirect dig at Christianity, which of course has a whole theology of adopted sonship, and that the non-Jews are the adopted children of God. But if adoption is illegitimate, then it is a delegitimization of Christianity. And one of the key elements of early Islam is not only an intent on delegitimizing Judaism, but also delegitimizing Christianity and demonizing both as enemies of the Muslims. If you look at the social and political and cultural milieu of the days in which the Arab Empire was expanding and consolidating, Jews and Christians are the principal enemies of that expansion and consolidation. And so they end up being canonized, so to speak, in the Quran as the worst enemies of the Muslims. Actually, of course, it says the Jews are the worst enemies of the Muslims, and that the Christians they will find closest to you, but then it hedges that around with caveats, saying that any Christian who believes that Jesus is the Son of God is under a curse, and so on. And so the only Christians that it ends up really talking about are Christians who are of a heretical sect that denies the divinity of Christ, denies even that he's the Son of God, denies that he is the Savior and died on a cross. There was Gnostic Christian literature that denied that Jesus died on the cross, and it appears that these were some of the traditions that the early Muslims picked up to create the teachings about Jesus that are in the Quran and Islam. And so I come back around in the conclusion to where I started at the beginning, that there is no mention of the Quran from people who are supposed to have been motivated by it and energized by it in the first 6 decades of its supposed immediate ascendancy and its being the inspiration for these great conquests. And the only explanation for that is that it didn't exist yet, and it was put together later out of Jewish and Christian material, mostly from heretical Christians, who left the mark of their doctrines on it. And these doctrines were adulterated then by the Arab leaders in order to paint Judaism and Christianity in the most negative light possible. But in any case, there is, in all of this time, in the first part of the 7th century, after the time that Muhammad is supposed to have died, and even into the 8th century, there is very slight mention of Muhammad, very slight mention of the Quran. Then suddenly, in the 8th century, and particularly in the 9th, we begin to hear these stories of immense detail, where we know so much about Muhammad. We know practically everything that he did every day. And yet, where were these stories in the 7th century? Why do none of the early Muslims ever tell them or even mention their guiding prophet? Why is it that they hid these stories away if they had them and never even referred to them? Obviously, this is much more likely to have been a process of legendary elaboration, and that once Muhammad was established as a figure who was going to be the center of this religion and somebody who was worthy of emulation, then it became necessary for people to fill in the story about him and to make up accounts of what he said and did. One of the most notable things about this is that the Arabs, in the time that Muhammad is supposed to have lived, up until the year 627, actually used a calendar that was a lunar calendar, but it contained leap months, that is, extra whole months, that would bring the lunar calendar in line with the solar calendar. Now, the funny thing about this is that the leap months were abolished in 627, and in the accounts of Muhammad's life, he never does anything in leap months. And yet, he's supposed to have been 57 years old in 627, so he lived all his life with leap months, and yet he never did anything during them. Obviously, the best explanation for that is that the stories were invented at a time when the Arabs forgot they ever had leap months. And so they never put any stories in those times. But that just shows up the legendary character of this material.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, David. We're going to go take a brief break here. We've got the opening statements out of our way, 12 minutes apiece. We'll be right back. And just to let you know, too, anyone watching, just make sure that you get your questions or comments ready at 248-416-1300. Toward the end of the program, we'll start opening up the phone lines. For right now, though, we'll take this brief break. Come right back. Welcome back to this program, Jihad Watch, with the topic of tonight, Did Muhammad Exist? We have both of our debaters, Robert Spencer and David Wood, with their 12-minute opening statements. Now we're going to go back to David with a rebuttal. David, it's all you. You've got 8 minutes, and we'll tell you when you have 30 seconds left.
Thank you, Chris. All right, well, there are a few things Robert and I agree on. We agree that there should be evidence where there is no evidence. If Muhammad were really going out and conquering, and then his followers were to carry this on in the name of Islam, energized by the Quran, as Robert says, then we should expect to find all these references in all these places for all these people who are being conquered. We should expect to find all kinds of references to the Quran and Muhammad, and we don't, not for a long time. So we have to ask ourselves why. We have to ask ourselves why this is, and we both agree that that is a huge problem for the Muslim story, and we agree that there's a way of examining material like this and coming up with historical kernels of truth, and that's the principle of embarrassment. Where we disagree on here is Robert thinks there are explanations for these things, and that's the response to the principle of embarrassment. If I say no one would invent this kind of story, and you can come up with reasons why people would invent that kind of story, then you've just responded to the argument. So the question is, do Robert's reasons for why people would invent these kinds of stories about Muhammad, do they look like good explanations or the best explanations for the evidence that we have? And I would say no. If you look at the approach Robert is taking, he has a kind of means-to-end approach. There's something that the people who are inventing stories about Muhammad want to accomplish. There's some doctrine they want to get across, and so they invent this story in order to justify this doctrine or defend this kind of doctrine? And my response would be, I can easily come up with a different way of achieving the same end that doesn't involve embarrassing Muhammad. In other words, if the only point is to defend some doctrine, I can think of better ways to defend that doctrine without making Muhammad look bad. So let's go through these. Muhammad's first impression of his revelations is that he was demon-possessed, and he became suicidal afterwards. Robert's claim is that these stories might have been invented because people wanted to show that Muhammad wasn't a victim of demonic possession, and he didn't kill himself because he was protected or something like that, because he was exonerated in the end of these stories. Now think, if all you want to show is that Muhammad isn't getting these by demonic inspiration, why don't you just say that? Why don't you have people saying it to Muhammad? Muhammad, you're the victim of demonic possession. You're possessed. You're so horrible, something like that. And then Muhammad saying, no, I'm not, and here's my proof. Here are some miracles. Because you can invent whatever you want, right? We're inventing prophets out of thin air here, or at least with very little historical information to go on. You can invent all kinds of ways to justify and show that someone is not possessed by demons. You can have a miraculous sign, a voice of God, something like that that justifies him. You don't need to make him look like he can't tell the difference between a revelation from God and a revelation from Satan, or make him look unsure of the origin of his revelations. We have the satanic verses, and this for me, this is the most important one, because I have 37 sources that describe variations of the satanic verses story, and there's a clear pattern of development. Namely, in the earliest versions of the story, Muhammad delivers these verses to his followers. He's tricked by Satan. Satan tricks him into delivering these revelations, and then Muhammad comes back later and says, the devil tricked me. Later versions of the story, Muhammad didn't deliver the verses. Satan just imitated Muhammad and sounded like him. So he imitated Muhammad's voice, and so people thought it was Muhammad, but then it wasn't really Muhammad. Still later, people cut out all of that out, and just have the pagans bowing down in honor of this revelation. Well, why were they bowing down? According to the original story, they were bowing down because Muhammad honored their gods. But later, they just had the story about the pagans bowing down, and it's the context is totally taken out. And so you lose the historical core by the time you get to the great collections of ahadith. So what you have is, obviously the story was very embarrassing even at its earliest stages, because Muslims immediately start trying to water the story down and eventually try to get rid of it altogether. In fact, by the time Ibn Hisham comes up with his recension of Ibn Ishaq, he takes the story out because it was too embarrassing to Muslims. Now the question is, why would someone invent this kind of story if it was obviously so embarrassing? And Robert's explanation was, hey, these things are in a state of flux. Different people are coming up with different things. But I have this kind of idea of what I would call historical momentum. In order for a story to kind of push through several generations when it's obviously embarrassing to the people, it needs to have a certain amount of momentum. And a person or a group of people coming up with this story one day that's obviously embarrassing to the Muslim, to the community at large, it's not going to have the kind of momentum that's going to push it through several generations and have Muslims trying to explain it away. They're just going to reject it. The only way that it could have that momentum to go through several generations is if the first generation knew that it happened, and that's why they passed it on. And the second generation knew that it happened because their parents told them. And then it's not until you start getting farther and farther away that people can start watering the story down. And so I would say for all of these stories, the only way these stories would keep going is if we had a certain amount of historical momentum that I just don't see happening if someone's sitting around free to invent these stories. Now, the story of Muhammad as a victim of black magic, well, Muhammad was victorious in the end. Well, again, you could do that in other ways. You don't need to have, I mean, think about it. Jesus wasn't the victim of black magic, right? We don't believe that would happen to Jesus. But it doesn't occur to us to say, well, yeah, he was a victim of a spell, and he was walking around all weird and out of his mind and delusional for a year and a half, but then he was victorious in the end. Why? We don't need that. We don't need that. If we want to know why we believe in Jesus, it would have to do with things like his miracles or his resurrection. We don't need him to succumb to black magic in order to break free of it to show that we should believe in him. As far as Muhammad's extra wives, Robert says, well, this was to show that he was superior in, sexual virility or something like that. Again, you don't need that. Muhammad could have had 4 wives. He could have stayed faithful to his 4 wives, to that revelation. and he could have just had a lot of sex with them. And then, of course, he's allowed to have a slave girl, so he could have 4 wives and like 100 slave girls, and that would have allowed him to stay consistent with his revelation. Instead, we find him getting special revelations that give him more partners. That if the only goal is to be really sexually mighty, he didn't need to do that at all. As far as Muhammad's death, Robert says that the story was meant to demonize Jews. Well, you could have had him die in battle. You could have had him die in battle fighting the Jews. I mean, really, being defeated after being poisoned by a Jewish woman whose family he had slaughtered, that makes me think that Muhammad's not too bright. I mean, he's eating food brought to him by a woman whose family he just slaughtered. I wouldn't eat something that was brought to someone whose family was just slaughtered, but Muhammad does. This doesn't inspire any confidence in Muhammad. So if the goal...
30 seconds.
And finally, Zainab, Robert says that the point of this story is to deny that Muhammad had any children. Again, any sons. There's a way to do that. Again, you don't have to have this entire affair of Muhammad marrying the divorced wife of his own adopted son and so on. You could just say Muhammad didn't have any sons, or that his sons died, something like that. Point is, we can have all of these ends that Robert says we need. We can do that without these horrible stories that are obviously embarrassing to the early Muslim community.
Okay. Thank you, David, for your 8-minute rebuttal. Now we're going to reset the clock for Robert, and we're going to go ahead and give Robert 8 minutes to go ahead and do that. Guy hearing a buzzing in my ear. I'm not sure what that's about.
Are we ready to go?
We're ready.
Okay. Actually, none of these stories were embarrassing to the early Muslims, according to the early Muslim records, except the Zainab story. That's the only one. It has to be emphasized that all the others that David has adduced here, the demon possession, the suicidal tendencies, even the satanic verses, the black magic, the special exception for the extra wives, and the poisoning by the Jews, there is no hint in the Islamic traditions. Well, leave aside the satanic verses, that's a special case also. But there's no hint for any of the others that they were embarrassing to the early Muslims. It's just like with the story of Muhammad and Aisha, and his consummating the marriage with Aisha when she was 9 and he was 54. There's no indication that anybody looked askance at that, or that the early Muslims thought there was anything scandalous about that. That's a tale that embarrasses 21st century Muslims, as the rest of these that David has pointed out. They embarrass 21st century Muslims, but they didn't embarrass Muslims in the 9th century or the 8th. Now, as far as the other things go, certainly, yes, there are other better ways to defend doctrines than inventing stories that embarrass Muhammad. But here again, I'm afraid that David is practicing kind of anachronism. It's easy for 21st century people to see that there were easier ways to do this or better ways to do this, but we cannot be sure that that was known or seen as clearly by Muslims in the 9th century or the 8th century when these stories were being invented. They were invented in a particular historical context, and it may be that they were invented in the context of controversies that were going on that they were designed to reply to. And that being the case, it may be that they were invented in order to serve particular ends that we cannot know today. But here again, the long historical gap between the time that Muhammad is supposed to have lived and the time that these stories show up militates against their being historically accurate. After all, we're talking about, David's point is well taken about there's nothing in the story, in the Gospels, about Jesus being the victim of black magic. It's made very clear in other ways that he has power over that kind of thing. He doesn't have to walk around under its influence for a year and a half and so on. But here again, when we're talking about Islam, we're talking about a very different cultural context where the existence of jinns is taken for granted. The existence of mischievous spirits who are always interfering with the daily lives of ordinary human beings is taken for granted. And so it's just, I think, a mistake to assume that it would have been so clear to the early Muslims that there were easier ways to establish the points that they wanted to establish. Now, as far as the satanic verses go, clearly, yes, the embarrassment of that story set in rather quickly. And that's why, as David points out, there are these various stages where first Muhammad is inspired by Satan, and then it's Satan imitating Muhammad, and then it's the pagans bowing down about these stories without any context regarding Muhammad or the Quran or Islam. But here again, it's not necessarily established from that the first generation knew that it happened, that Muhammad had done that, and that therefore they had to explain it away somehow. It's also perfectly reasonable to consider that the story was first invented by the Arab leaders in order to paper over various contradictions and changes that they were making in Islamic doctrine as it was developing. But then, once it was out there, they had to explain it away because they realized that they had entangled themselves in a new contradiction by having their wonderful, infallible prophet, who is the perfect model of human behavior, have this inspiration from Satan. And so it was a story, it's like when you tell a lie and then you have to tell another lie to cover it up. They had invented this story in order to explain contradictions in their own material, but then they had to explain away their explanation. And so it might not be that the first generation knew that Muhammad had done it, but that the first generation knew that it had been widely published, and so that had to be explained away. But it doesn't necessarily have any connection to any real Muhammad at all. What we're talking about, after all, is stories that arise in the 9th century, 125, 150, 200 years after Muhammad is supposed to have lived. And so we're talking about stories of which there is no indication whatsoever before that. And let me just give you an example of the reliability of the sources upon which we're relying to talk about all this. Let me give you an account of the raid of Kharar from Ibn Ishaq, Muhammad's first biographer, from the middle of the 8th century. And he says this is all he says about the Battle of Kharar. Meanwhile, the messenger of God had sent Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas on campaign with 8 men from among the Muhajirun. He went as far as Kharar in the Hijaz, then he returned without having had a clash with the enemy. 50 years later, Al-Waqidi has all this. Then the messenger of God appointed Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas to the command against Kharar, Kharar being part of Jufa near Qum, in Dhul Qadda, 18 months after the hijrah of the messenger. Abu Bakr ibn Ismail ibn Muhammad said on the authority of his father, on the authority of Amir ibn Sa'ad, on the authority of his father, the messenger of God said, O Sa'ad, go to Kharar, for a caravan belonging to Quraysh will pass through it. So I went out with 20 or 21 men on foot. We would hide during the day and travel at night until we arrived there on the morning of the 5th day. We found that the caravan had passed through the day before. The messenger had enjoined upon us not to go beyond Kharar. Had we not done so, I would have tried to catch up with it. How is it that Al-Waqidi knows so much more detail about this story 50 years after Ibn Ishaq? Obviously, it was made up. But it was made up in a cultural context that is so immensely different from the one in which we are operating now, that it would be presumptuous for us to assume that we can know all the reasons why these stories were invented. Here again, the criterion of embarrassment is an important one, but what embarrasses us does not embarrass necessarily the Muslims of the time in which these stories were being developed. And the historical gap between the time when Muhammad is supposed to have lived and the time that these stories arose makes it impossible for these to have been historically accurate. And I guess I still have more time.
I think if you would like to speak more, you have more time. Unless you'd like to, we can go right into.
David, if you can try to answer that, you're welcome to have more time.
We could transition right into, David, the 12-minute portion, right? We'll call it approximately 12 minutes, just to have a conversation back and forth, a little bit of a crossfire. And David, we'll go ahead and start with you if you want to go ahead and respond to anything that's been just that Robert has just said.
Oh, I'd like to respond to several things, but before I blast Robert, I wanted to address something very quickly that's a point that we agree on, and I've seen lots of people, like in comments sections and so on blogs and so on, who don't seem to get this point. We're saying that there should be a lot of evidence, a lot of early evidence from Muhammad if the basic Muslim story is accurate. And people keep reciting this little phrase, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. In other words, just because you don't have this early evidence doesn't mean nothing was happening there. And that is a valid principle in certain contexts, but this isn't one of them. In other words, it depends on the situation. For instance, if I said, hey, I look around the room, I don't see an elephant, therefore I conclude that there's no elephant here. The reason that would be justified is an elephant is a massive creature. If one were in the room, I would expect to see it. I would have good reason to expect to see it. But if I looked around the room and I said, I don't see any insects, I don't see any bugs, therefore there are no bugs, that wouldn't be a fair inference, because if there were a bug behind a dresser or something like that, or under a chair, I wouldn't expect to see it. So it depends on the situation. And what we're saying about Muhammad is we're not talking about some random individual. We're talking about someone who sent out all these followers who are conquering in his name, who are doing all kinds of things. And since they're spreading all throughout Arabia and into other places, we should have lots of records of this because it was such a massive event, and we don't, and that's a problem. So, Robert, I was wondering what you think of this idea that we're unjustified in saying that there should be this evidence there because absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important point, and I can tell you this: if there were no records of any kind from that period, then the people who say absence of evidence is not evidence of absence would have a point. Because we would say, well, we simply don't know what happened at this time, but we have all this Islamic material, we can give it the benefit of the doubt. But actually we do have an abundance of recorded information from the period in which the early Arabs were conquering. And for example, take Sophronius of Jerusalem. According to the Muslim account, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Sophronius, he met the Caliph Umar at the gates of Jerusalem and gave him the key to the city after Umar had conquered Jerusalem. This is around 636 or 637, and supposedly 4 or 5 years after Muhammad died. And Umar walked around Jerusalem with Sophronius, but he declined to go inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and pray. And this is supposed to be evidence of early Muslim magnanimity, because Umar knew that if he went into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and prayed, that the Muslims would convert it into a mosque. So out of generosity and respect for the Christians, he didn't go in there and pray. Now, that's a great story. It's a famous story. It also has no historical reliability at all. We first hear that story several hundred years after the events it's supposed to recount. But we have letters and sermons of Sophronius himself that have survived. And in them, he speaks very movingly about how the Saracens, the Ishmaelites, came and laid waste, and how they conquered the area, and how he sees it as God's judgment upon the Christians of his day. But one thing he never says, several things he never says. He never says the Muslims came and conquered. He never calls them Muslims. He shows no awareness that they had a holy book. He shows no awareness that they had a prophet. He shows no awareness that they came with a new religion. This is extraordinary. This guy was actually conquered by these people, and he's writing about the conquest. And so that is not absence of evidence. That is positive evidence that the people who conquered Jerusalem were not actually Muslims at all, and that Muhammad did not exist yet, and the Quran did not exist yet, because if they did, there is absolutely no reason why Sophronius would not have mentioned them.
All right, Robert, now I want to address your claim that these stories weren't embarrassing to the early Muslim community, because I think they were all embarrassing to the early Muslim community. I think we're reading the sources a little differently. I'm not going off of straightforward claims that these were embarrassing. I'm kind of comparing the narrations and connecting the dots. For instance, I can open up one narration from the Hadith, and it will say, Muhammad was the victim of black magic because of a spell cast on him. And that's it. That would be the whole story. And eventually he snapped out of it. And then I go to another story, and Muhammad snaps out of it because, some kind of angels show up and stuff and snap him out of it. And then I go to another version of the story, and Muhammad's victorious, and he says, go to the well and you'll find the hairbrush, and here's who did it, and so on. And so I have these stories in front of me, and I say, the original story about Muhammad just being the victim of black magic, you wouldn't have left out that later vindication. You wouldn't have left out that later vindication if you were aware of it. So I'm looking at this, and I'm kind of arranging them in my mind. Obviously, the original story is, just included Muhammad being the victim of black magic, and he eventually snapped out of it and blamed someone. And then it's later stories where there's something miraculous about it, some kind of miraculous vindication. And so I reason that the early story wouldn't have left that out if there was this extra information. So I'm putting them in a historical development, and I'm saying, well, if someone's obviously inventing this extra vindication, it's because the earlier story was embarrassing to the early Muslim community. And since it was embarrassing, why would someone invent it? And I would say that's the case with all of these stories, that if you compare the different versions, you look at more and more, as time goes on, they're trying to vindicate Muhammad. And if they're trying to vindicate him and defend him, obviously they were embarrassing to the early Muslim community. And therefore, I wonder, if we have the freedom to invent things, why are we inventing these things that are so embarrassing that people are expanding on them through legendary development?
Okay, very good point. However, it has to be emphasized that you are the one who are seeing the three different versions of the story and saying the one that simply says Muhammad was the victim of black magic has to have been the original, because it doesn't contain the justification of Muhammad. And that, however, when we come to the sources, we know that they're all just there in the Hadith. And there's no indication, actually, from the Hadith itself that that was the original version of the story. That actually could be the last version of the story. Now, why would that be the last version of the story? Well, there are any number of reasons. It could be a fragment. It could be an abbreviation. It could be something that was put there for some other reason. But the idea that that was necessarily the original version of the story, and that the elaborations justifying Muhammad came later, that is something that you are imposing upon the evidence from without. Because actually we have no way of knowing what the original version of the story was. All of the stories are late. All of the stories come in material that suddenly is part of this sudden proliferation and explosion of material about Muhammad that arises in the 9th century, when actually before that we don't know anything about him at all. It also may be that the figure of Muhammad in the Hadith and in Islamic tradition in general is a composite of several figures, and that material was taken from material about other people who may have done some of the things that Muhammad did, or Muhammad is said to have done, and who may have actually left traces in the memory of the people who are recounting. These things were not invented out of nothing. The Arab leaders, when they invented Islam, beginning in the 690s and stepping up in energy in the 8th century and particularly in the 9th century, they didn't just sit down and make these things up out of their heads. They used existing material. We can see very clearly in the Quran that they used existing Jewish and Christian sources primarily. But also in the Hadith, it is very likely that they drew upon accounts of various figures, various heroes, various famous figures among the Arabs, and used them to create Muhammad. And so it's possible that these things, that it might be that that was the original version of the story, but even that wouldn't get you any closer to a historical Muhammad than we already were to start with.
All right, now I want to point out a kind of shift in your methodology. When you were initially responding to these embarrassing stories, you were saying, here are clear reasons why someone would invent these stories. And now you're saying of at least some of the points, the embellishment on the story of the black magic and so on, that we just don't know. There could be a reason why things are reversed and not the way they appear in my mind. There could be a reason, and we just don't know it. Well, that goes into me weighing these options. If I sit here and I say, here are various accounts, and I can put them in a certain order, and it makes perfect sense why they would develop in that way. In other words, Muhammad really was not necessarily the victim of black magic. I don't necessarily believe that was true. But he was acting weird for a while. He snapped out of it, and he says, someone cast a spell on me, in order to explain why he was the victim of this black magic. Later Muslims saw this as kind of an embarrassing story, and they wanted to attach various miraculous endings onto the story. I look at that and I say, that makes sense. I can understand that historical development. So now I have something that makes perfect sense in my mind, but it presupposes that Muhammad existed. In other words, if that account is correct, it involves Muhammad's existence as the sort of start, as the beginning of that process. Your response is, well, you don't know that the short version that doesn't have a miraculous ending, that could have been the last, and we just don't know why. We just don't know why that is. Well, now I can't even make sense of it. And I will grant, just to be clear, I will grant that it's possible. I grant that lots of things are possible. But if I have one hypothesis that's very clear and involves a clear progression, and I can understand each of the steps, and I understand why these things happen, I understand the progression, and then the alternative is something I say, well, I can't make sense of that at all, but maybe it's true. Well, I'm inclined to go with the one that makes sense. I'm inclined to go with the one that makes clear sense in my mind. And I want to point out, it's not just this one story. It's not just this one story. If it were one story, if we had one story to deal with, or two or three, then I might say, maybe we could explain these things away. But when we have a ton of stories, I look at this and I say, that is not the picture of a prophet I would ever want to come up with. And to say, well, maybe they saw things differently, when I can't understand why anyone in his right mind, out of his right mind would invent these things, then I have to go with what makes most sense. And what makes most sense to me is these things happened, they were embarrassing, and later Muslims tried to explain them away.
Sure, absolutely. That is a possibility. The thing is that one thing I would caution you about is that what makes sense is not necessarily what happened, especially when we're dealing with this material. This is extraordinarily strange material, and there are all sorts of oddities about it. And I'm not sure that making sense, it might be, but I'm not convinced myself that making sense is a compelling argument in this case because of the strangeness of this material. And I would say I don't think there's a shift in my methodology at all. These things, I think, in a tremendous degree were invented. Actually, as you know, the Muslim scholars themselves, in explaining the forged hadith, acknowledge that a huge number, I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands, like the 297,000 hadith that Bukhari collected and then rejected as inauthentic, were manufactured for political reasons, for political motives. And that the only criteria by which he decided that the 3,000 that he did use were authentic was the chain of transmitters, which of course could just as easily be forged as well as the story. And so we're talking about a huge proliferation of material that's acknowledged to have been forged for political reasons. And all I'm saying is we might be able to discern the reasons why various stories were developed in some cases. We might not be able to tell why stories were developed in some cases because we don't have all the information at hand. And it may be that some of them refer to historical figures who were used to make up the figure of Muhammad, but the yawning historical gap between the time that Muhammad is supposed to have lived and when these stories first appear make it very unlikely that however embarrassing they may be and however much your reconstruction of events makes sense, it still is very unlikely that they refer to a historical Muhammad, because if they did, then one would expect, as we have discussed, there to have been some mention of this fellow long before we ever hear anything about him.
Okay, we're going to have to sneak in here a quick break. Robert and David, thank you for the continued ongoing discussion here of tonight's topic, which is, did Muhammad exist? We'll be right back with closing statements. And again, just stay tuned with your calls at 248-416-1300. We'll be right back after this brief break. And welcome back. We have the last portion of tonight's program, Jihad Watch. Did Muhammad exist? We're going to throw it to David. David, you've had 5 minutes to make your closing comments right now.
All right. Well, we have two hypotheses before us. We have Robert's hypothesis and we have my hypothesis. And each one kind of has something going for it, and each one has a significant problem. So Robert's view is that the Muhammad we're familiar with, not necessarily the Muhammad that Muslims believed in who actually talked to the angel Gabriel, but in general, the sort of Muhammad you'd read about in the Encyclopedia Britannica or something like that, that Muhammad didn't exist. And what Robert has going for him in this case is this big gaping hole where there should be all kinds of evidence about this person, and it's just not there. So we would expect to find evidence. We don't find the evidence. That's a problem for the hypothesis. The problem I see with Robert's hypothesis, as I've said, is that ultimately it requires me to believe that someone was inventing things, and they invented things that I just can't come up with any explanation. Robert says, well, it doesn't have to make sense. It might not make sense. Well, yeah, but I mean, if I'm just going to say, hey, this doesn't make sense, maybe it just doesn't make sense, then I've ceased trying to come up with a good explanation of things. So I'm looking back at these stories and I'm saying, is there any earthly way I can see people inventing these things? So at some point in history, Robert's story requires me to believe that some people somewhere were making a list of things, making a list of stories, writing their stories, and they say, let's say he had sex with a 9-year-old girl. Let's say he allowed his followers to have sex with captives. Let's say he allowed his followers to have sex with prostitutes. Let's say that he enslaved people. Let's say that he tortured people for money. Can I imagine a reason for inventing these stories? And the answer is yes, for those stories. I can imagine, since these were accepted in 7th century and 8th century Arabian culture, I can imagine someone inventing these things. But the list keeps going, my friends. And then I start getting to stories where, wait a minute, why are you telling me that he believed he was demon-possessed? Why are you telling me that he was a victim of black magic? Why are you telling me this guy's standing on a cliff about to jump off? Why are you telling me that he violated his own revelations? Why are you telling me that he married the divorced wife of his own adopted son? Why are you telling me that even though he admittedly wanted to die a martyr's death in battle. He was killed by a Jewish woman whose family he'd slaughtered. Why are you telling me these sorts of things? Why are these part of this story? Why were these added? And I can't come up with an explanation. Robert has offered some possible solutions. There is a possible reason, but when I think about it, I think, hey, I can come up with better ways of achieving that goal if that was the goal. So I am trying to make sense of these things, and I'm looking at the total picture and saying, there is no way anyone would come up with this figure Muhammad, to unite Arab culture. Obviously, these things were very embarrassing to the early Muslim community, at least in several of the instances. Why would someone invent this when they can invent other things that would make him look very good? And I don't see a clear answer to that. And so I look at the theory, and now I'm looking around for an alternative. What's the alternative to Muhammad not existing? Well, Muhammad existing. And so the question is, can we look at Muhammad and say, yes, he existed, and yes, he did some of the basic things that are attributed to him, and yet can we explain this big gaping hole? Why is there so little evidence? Why is there so few references to the Quran for so long? Why are there so few references to Muhammad for so long? And I think we find the answer in the Muslim sources. We didn't really talk about this, but in the Muslim sources you find that Muhammad, when preaching his original message, wasn't very successful. He won several dozen followers after about 12 years of preaching, several dozen followers. Not exactly a Billy Graham crusade. It's only when he turned to other methods, namely, people join me, will go out, will conquer the unbelievers, will rape their women, will take their booty, I'll take a fifth, you take the rest, this is how we're going to do it, and the religion grew like wildfire. But in the Muslim sources, we find these Muslims, these converts, constantly complaining, why aren't we getting more money? Hey, you said we'd get a bunch of money, why aren't we getting it? They're constantly complaining, which shows they weren't really interested in Muhammad. They weren't really interested in Islam. They weren't really interested in the Quran. They were in this to go out and conquer and fight and subjugate people and get lots of stuff for themselves. And so if these are the people really that went out fighting, this army of people who are concerned with war booty, then we wouldn't expect to find lots of information about Muhammad or the Quran because they just didn't care. And it may have taken several generations of people kind of brainwashing their children. Muhammad is the great moral example, and you must talk about him all day long. You must talk about the Quran all day long. It could have been several generations before that mindset set in. And so we're looking at these two hypotheses. I don't think Robert's hypothesis accounts very well for the embarrassing material. It accounts very well for the gaping hole. And the question is, does Muhammad's existence, can we account for this gaping hole? I think we can just by understanding the Muslim sources that there was not a lot of emphasis for a lot of people on believing Muhammad. The emphasis was on. So, again, we're weighing the hypotheses. One of these hypotheses makes more sense to me than the other, and so I conclude that Muhammad existed, and that would be my case for Muhammad's existence as the best explanation for all the data. Robert and I, at the end of the day, we're working with the same data. It's going to come down to what we place more emphasis on. Do we place more emphasis on having early sources? Do we place more emphasis on the principle of embarrassment? That can affect our answers a little, but we are coming down to different conclusions here. That's my case for why I believe Muhammad existed.
Okay, thank you, David. Very good use of your 5 minutes. And at this point, we'll reset the clock for Robert for his formal final conclusion. Then we'll go to our caller. So, Robert, go right ahead.
Thank you. The criteria of embarrassment, I have indeed given explanations earlier. I'm not going to repeat them now for all the stories that David adduces as being so embarrassing as to indicate that they would not have been invented. There are various explanations as to why they would have been invented. And then there are some things that we simply cannot know. David says that, well, it's if something just doesn't make sense, and then I have an explanation that makes sense, I'm obviously going to go with the explanation that makes sense. That's perfectly reasonable. And in ordinary circumstances, that would be exactly what I would advise. But these are not ordinary circumstances. There is a great deal that is absolutely inexplicable about this material. I don't know if you can see this coin, but it is in my book, Did Muhammad Exist? And it is a coin from Syria from the 680s. And on one side, it says Muhammad. And on the other side, it's got a picture of a ruler holding a cross. Now, anybody who knows anything about Islam knows that Muhammad is supposed to have said that Jesus will come back at the end of the world and break all crosses. And the Quran says that they did not slay him or crucify him, but it appeared so unto them. Now, why, if the early Muslims knew that Islam abhors the cross and rejects the cross and is the enemy of the cross, why would they mint coins that said Muhammad and had a cross on them? There's just no explanation for that. We can surmise that the word Muhammad was being used at that time as a title, the praised one, and being applied perhaps to Jesus or perhaps to the ruler depicted, but that it was not clearly the prophet of Islam, or there wouldn't have been a cross. Also, I'm afraid that David, for all his marvelous argumentation tonight, entangled himself in a contradiction right at the end when he said that it may be that the followers of Muhammad were simply interested in conquest and in booty, and so they didn't really care about Muhammad. And so they went out and they conquered and they didn't talk about Muhammad. And that all makes sense. But then later, he said, after having it being drilled into them generation after generation that Muhammad is the excellent exemplar and the perfect model for human behavior, they started talking about Muhammad. Well, wait a minute. If they didn't value Muhammad, then why did they drill it into their children that they had to emulate Muhammad? And if they didn't care about what Muhammad said and did, so much so that they never mentioned him, then why did they save all this incredible proliferation of material about what Muhammad said and did, and yet never give any hint that they actually had it? I think that's far harder to believe than that Muhammad was a figure who was invented in the 8th century and the 9th century. If Muhammad existed, then the people who came out of Arabia and conquered, even if they didn't care about him, we're supposed to believe now that they put away these stories in a trunk somewhere and saved them or memorized them, but never mentioned them and never gave any hint of their existence until much later. That seems to me to be absolutely inexplicable. Why, if they saved them, would they not mention them? And why, if they didn't value them, would they save them? Also, we know that the early caliphs, according to Islamic tradition, Abu Bakr was such a fanatical follower of Muhammad that there was nothing that would shake his faith. And there are many stories about that in the Hadith. Umar and Uthman were second only to Abu Bakr in fanaticism. After that, you get Ali, the son-in-law of Muhammad. You get Muawiyah, who was the son of Abu Sufyan, who was Muhammad's great opponent, who was defeated by Muhammad and then converted to Islam. Muawiyah was raised a Muslim. Why, in all this period, when these people who knew and loved Muhammad were the leaders of the Muslim community, and they were the ones who were supposed to be in charge of the Muslim community, they never mentioned Muhammad? Not only that, we have an inscription on an official building in Gadara from the time of Muawiyah that mentions that it was built during the time of the caliphate of Muawiyah. And yet it's got a cross at the beginning of it. Here again, Islam abhors the cross. If Muhammad had existed and taught that Jesus is going to come back and break all the crosses, and Muawiyah rather, grew up at Muhammad's knee, hearing these stories and revering Muhammad as a prophet, then he's going to go out when he becomes caliph many years later and make a public building that's got a cross on it? It's inexplicable. It's especially inexplicable if Muhammad existed. If Muhammad didn't exist and Islam developed later, then it becomes explicable. And so ultimately, while I think David has made the strongest possible case for Muhammad's existence, I have to, with great respect and with gratitude to him for arguing the case so rationally and also so politely, in sharp contrast to the venomous hatred that we usually get from Muslim debaters instead of reasoned analysis, I have to reject the arguments and maintain that Muhammad did not exist.
Okay. Well, Robert, thank you very much. And David, thank you as well. The timing is great because we're right now going to be taking our first caller. And I didn't catch the name, but Ricky from the UK. Ricky, go ahead and give us your question. Who is it directed to?
Hello, my question is to Robert Spencer. Robert, is it not possible that Muslims may have destroyed or burned all evidences of Islam to get a standardized version?
To get a standardized version, yes. Well, that's actually the standardized version story. That in 656, Uthman, the caliph, is supposed to have gathered together all the people who memorized the Quran, and they wrote down, it was written down rather, all the pieces of the Quran that various people had memorized, and then Uthman burnt the variants. But then you have a standard story. You have a standard Quran. Uthman is supposed to have distributed that Quran to all the Muslim provinces. And this is in the year 656. And yet, even during the continued conquests after that, there is no mention of the Quran. No mention of the Quran from the Arabs, no mention of the Quran from the people they conquered. The people they conquered never say, and they came with a holy book that they said was the new book of God. And the Arabs never give any hint that they have any holy book. For another 50 years. Only 50 years later do you start hearing about the Quran. And even then it's very curious how you hear about it, because you don't hear about the Quran as such. Various non-Muslim writers start mentioning, only at that time, at the beginning of the 700s, that the Muslims have a holy book, this Quran. But one of them, notably, he says, they say they have a Quran and they have another book, Surah al-Baqarah. Now, Surah al-Baqarah is the second chapter of the Quran, the chapter of the cow. You never refer to a chapter of a book as a separate book, unless it is a separate book, unless the whole thing hadn't been collected together at that time. And yet that's 50 years after it's supposed to have happened. So there is a standard account. But the standard account just simply doesn't hold up historically.
Okay, David, would you like to respond at all to that?
Yeah, I'd just like to add that, as Robert points out in his book, there were actually, even according to the standard Muslim accounts, if we believe the standard Muslim accounts, there were two stages of let's destroy the earlier evidence and put out our new versions. You had, of course, during the reign of Uthman, gathering the materials together, burning them all, and so on, putting out their standard edition, but also later under the Abdul Malik and Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, doing the same thing again, according to certain Muslim sources. So, I mean, Muslims aren't aware of this, and it's kind of disturbing, given every Muslim you go to has this idea of perfect preservation down to the letter since the beginning, since it was handed to Muhammad. And even if you go to the Muslim sources, that's absolute nonsense. And if you then conclude that these sources are reliable, well, now we're in Robert's position, and we don't have anything to go on with anything in the early Muslim community.
Okay. We have Isa online. And Isa, who is your question directed to, and what is your question?
It's more of a comment than a question, Chris.
Thank you.
I'd like to say good evening to Robert, David, and take a few seconds to pay homage to the men and women who died so we could have a TV show like this on this Memorial Day. And you gentlemen certainly have done your homework, and I am not tickling your ears. Give credit where credit is due. And whether Muhammad existed or didn't exist, to me is really irrelevant. But it prevailed on thousands and millions of people. And even nations, believe in this, and they're willing to die and willing to put their life and kill for it. And, whether he existed or not, I mean, it will only prevail for those people who are knowledgeable and literate. Remember, my brothers, Satan will always use reverse psychology, try to divide and conquer, and remember that knowledge speaks and wisdom listens. And I don't know how to put this in words, but I mean, we see, everything that's been written in Scripture coming to pass. Remember, if the prophet speaks for me, the Lord said, in time you'll see it will come to pass. And, again, I'd like to pay homage to Robert and Chris and Dave. And, gentlemen, you're doing a fine job, and God bless you and keep you safe.
God bless you.
Good night.
We appreciate that.
Can I just say one thing?
Absolutely.
I would just like to say, with respect, I thank you for your kind words. I do think it's a relevant question. It's a relevant question precisely because so many Muslims believe this. And the truth is always relevant. There are efforts right now being made to translate this book into Arabic. I also hope to get it translated into Farsi, Urdu, as many other languages that Muslims speak around the world as I possibly can. I'm trying to get Muslims to reevaluate this question and to think about it rationally. We saw in the debate last month with Anjem Choudary and Omar Bakri that it's very hard to get Muslims to consider this rationally. But if they step back, and I think that human nature is everywhere the same, and one God did create us all, and so it's not impossible that Muslims can consider this issue, and perhaps it would lead them to see that the jihad warfare and subjugation of unbelievers that they are pursuing, that they think that Allah wants them to pursue, is something that maybe they should reevaluate. And that is one of the chief hopes that I have for this book.
David, your comment at all?
Yeah, I just wanted to agree. Well, at first, I wanted to agree with the caller who pointed out that on this Memorial Day, I didn't even make the connection in my mind that this is Memorial Day when we remember the people who died to make this possible, because this wouldn't be possible in certain places in the world, as everyone knows. But also, yeah, I agree with Robert on the importance of this topic and the book and the discussion and the debate, because there's a massive gap between what's going on at a scholarly level in Islamic studies and what people know, the popular level. And in Christianity, you don't have that kind of gap. Whatever happens at the scholarly level, people put it out. Either people against Christianity or people on the side of Christianity, they discuss it at the popular level so people can find out what's going on. So you can go into any Christian bookstore and find discussions made for the popular level of what's going on at the scholarly level. In Islamic studies, there's what's going on at the scholarly level, and it never reaches people. It never gets down to the average person, and if the average person wants to know about it, it's very, very difficult to find out about these things, which is why we discuss these things in debates, and especially someone like Robert puts this material into books so that the discussion can get going, because even though, as Robert pointed out, it is very difficult to have discussions with certain Muslims, I also know for a fact that there are Muslims out there who are interested in the truth, but they've been fed bad information all their lives. And so for those Muslims out there who want to base their decisions on accurate information, we want to make that available to them.
And if those Muslims are watching this show right now, they have a few minutes left to call at 248-416-1300. We do have another caller. Marlene, tell us who your question is directed to and what is your question?
Yes. First, thank you, gentlemen, for all this effort that you're putting on these shows. And my question is for Robert Spencer. I wanted to ask him if he considered the story about the Nestorian monk Bahira and his influence in making Muhammad. And I noticed also that Muhammad had a different name that is mentioned. I forgot the name, very tough name. And my second request is to have Father Zakaria have an opinion on this book and a notation. I would be very interested in seeing how he would look at this interesting book that I'm definitely going to buy. Thank you so much. I'm just going to listen.
Thank you, Marlene.
Thank you. The story of the Nestorian monk Bahira, I actually recount that in detail in my biography of Muhammad, The Truth About Muhammad. But it's a story from the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq. The Sirah of Ibn Ishaq was written in the middle of the 8th century. And there is, as we have discussed already, no indication that any of this material existed before that. Now, that being the case, why would Muslims invent the story of Muhammad meeting Christians and meeting particularly Christian clerics? And that is, I think, probably because the Muslim literature, the Quran particularly, contains so much Christian material. As I said before, this was put together from existing sources. And so to explain why there was so much resonance between Islam and Christianity and Judaism, stories were invented of Muhammad having contact with various rabbis and with various Christian clerics, and that these stories were designed to show primarily that the rabbis and the Christian clerics saw that Muhammad was a prophet, but they did not want to admit it among their followers. They did not want to acknowledge it. So it's really all about how the Jews and Christians were perverse in rejecting Muhammad, and that's the ultimate goal of the stories. Muhammad does have a different name in some of the early Islamic traditions. I don't remember it either, but I know it's there, and that may be evidence of another thing that I mentioned earlier, that Muhammad could be a composite of various figures who were put together, and that some real historical evidence, some real historical material, rather, of some of these people was put together to form Muhammad. I also wanted to mention, as David had been talking about the scholarly level and the popular level in this, my book is designed to be a popular presentation of work that has been done by several courageous scholars for generations, notably Christoph Luxemburg and some others who are all credited in the book, of course. The Inara group in Europe is doing tremendous work on this. And that has to be mentioned. I would like to call attention to the work of groups like the Inara Group because as scholars, their material generally stays among scholars and is discussed among scholars. And this book is an attempt to bring these things out into the wider public discourse.
David, we have a couple minutes or less, actually. Go right ahead if you'd like to make any final comments.
Well, I would just to agree with the assessment of these sources on Muhammad running into Christians and so on. We do have in the Quran, so in what Muslims would regard as their earliest material, Muhammad is constantly being ridiculed, according to the Quran, for stealing his information, information about Christianity and Judaism from other people, and this actually fits in very well with either hypothesis, with either Robert's position or my position. On my position, you would have, yes, these are historical. That's very embarrassing. And then later on, all these stories about Muhammad actually interacting with people, especially the ones where Muhammad goes up to someone and they say, "Oh, we've been waiting for you because we read in our book that you were coming." When where in the book? What were you waiting on? Why in the world were you waiting for an Arabian prophet? Where is that? Of course, obviously. There's some development. So there's no dispute between me and Robert on whether there was development. I think anyone who's examining this, even close to objectively, has to say there was tons of legendary development. The question is how much, and I would say a lot, and Robert would say all of it.
Well, gentlemen, we are going to finish up the program. Robert, could you tell us how the viewers, what's the best way or a good way to get a cover or a copy of the book?
Well, Did Muhammad Exist should be available at any self-respecting bookstore, and it's also at Amazon.com online. And at my own website, jihadwatch.org, you will find a link there on the left sidebar to order it. And go to your bookstore, though, and ask them for it, and ask them why they're not carrying it. Because cowardice and fear of violent intimidation is getting to be a little bit too much in evidence in America today. And we need to stand for the freedom of speech. And so strike a blow for the freedom of speech. Go ask your bookstore for Did Muhammad Exist?
And my quote for tonight that's going to stick with me is the truth is always relevant. And that is certainly what we try to bring forth with this program and any program that we do here at ABN. And you can watch us at any time at www.abnsat.com, as you might be doing right now, and tell a friend, a family member, or even an enemy, if you'd like, about our programming here at ABN. We're grateful for both the gentlemen here, Robert Spencer in the studio here, and David Wood via Skype, great resource that we can use to do our programming. This live show on the internet, and we're grateful for all the viewers who are watching, those who have called in especially, and everyone out there. Continue to keep us in prayer. We continue to look toward you for our financial support here. You can always call us during our office hours at 248-416-1300. This is another program brought to you by the folks here at ABN, and I'm Chris Conway signing off for Jihad Watch. And tonight's topic, which was Did Muhammad Exist? The debate continues. Continue to watch what's going on here and help us any way you can. God bless you and have a wonderful remaining evening here on Memorial Day weekend. Thank you so much.